We can then specify the timeout. This is the amount of time that we will wait for the values to be set to the desired values from the database. If any of the tags don't match with the desired value, we will wait this full amount of time before failing the recipe execution and indicating that there's a timeout error. The float deadband for floating point signals is the amount in engineering units that's allowable difference to confirm that the values are within the range that they need to be. The recipe execution will not write to the OPC Systems.net tags if the desired value coming from the database matches the existing value of the OPC Systems.net tag. This float deadband property is that allowable range for those floating point signals as long as the OPC Systems.net tag is within the range of the desired tag of this value, then it won't need to write to that OPC Systems.net tag. You can also enable to write to values without feedback, and this way it just writes to the OPC Systems.net tag and does not do any checking to see that the values have been successfully written. This is the fastest way to execute recipes. If you're going to do continuous recipe execution, I would suggest to use this feature to disable feedback checking. Under the Tags tab is where we define the field names in the database to receive the tag names and the values. This is for the multiple record type, and notice that the tag names that we're going to write to are defined in the database table. Later we'll use the single record type and the queued type where we actually map specific tags to specific field names. That's a different table format. Under the Database tab, we'll define what database engine we want to connect to. In this example, we're going to choose SQL Server. What is the server name? That can be obtained from the SQL Server Management Studio. If we go back to there, I'm going to disconnect from the SQL Server engine and then select File, Connect. When the dialog first appears, there is the server name for your database engine. We'll copy and paste that into the server field. The database that we're going to connect to was called Recipe Test, and the table that we're going to receive the data from was multiple records. With SQL Server, we can use Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. The query string property is used to determine what data is returned from the table. It can be used to filter out all of the values from the table and only return a particular subset. In this first example, we're going to return all the values from the table. We will use this property later when we use the single record type to return specific records from the table. We are now ready to add the recipe configuration to the service with the Add button in the lower left. The recipe is then added to the list in the middle. You can have multiple recipes all running in the same service. We can then save the recipe configuration to a binary file. We'll use the name Recipe Test and click Save. Under Configure Options is where we would specify to automatically load that recipe configuration when the service starts back up. Then select Apply Changes in the lower right to make that retentive. The recipe is now ready to be executed just by transitioning the trigger tag from false to true. If you don't have a PLC to trigger that tag, you can go back to Configure Tags, select the local service, go to the trigger tag, enter a value of 1 or true, and click Apply Changes. If the execution is successful, you will see then the values 1, 2, and 3 in the value tags of 1, 2, and 3. And in the confirm tag, you will see a true value. In the error tag, we should have 0. You can also build a Visual Studio application with OPC Controls.net, as we have demonstrated in the training guide found under the program group OPC Systems.net Help. You'll see a training guide. There's a complete section on how to do recipe execution under the bookmark of Chapter 8, Configure Recipes. That's a step-by-step walkthrough of the OPCRecipe.net product as we're doing right now. Let's now change our recipe configuration type from a multiple record type to a single record type. Select the multiple records recipe execution in the middle list and uncheck the recipe active feature and click Apply Changes. Now let's enter in a new recipe name of single record. Check the recipe active checkbox, set the record type to single record. We can leave the execution type as event driven and trigger the execution still based upon the trigger tag. Under the tags column, now we can see that we would map specific OPCSystems.net tags to field names. So let's go back to the SQL Server Management Studio and let's define a new table that is record-based. Under the Databases object, double-click on Recipe Test, select the Tables object, right-click on that, and select New Table. In this table format, each value will have its own field name. So we'll enter in a field name of value 01 with the data type of float, value 02 also as a data type of float, and value 03 float. Let's also implement the query string property in the recipe configuration, and we'll enter in another column which is lot number. For the data type, we will choose integer. We can now save this table as single record. We can close the design view, and now we're ready to right-click on that table and open the table. For value 01, we'll enter in a value of 101, value 02, 102, value 03, 103, and the lot number we'll enter in a value of 1. We'll create a second record now of 201, 202, and 203 for the respective value fields, and a lot number of 2. Now let's go back to the Configure application. Under the Configure Recipe section, we're now ready to map those field names of value 01, 02, and 03 to the OPCSystems.net tags. Select the Add Field button or right-click in the field list and select Add. Select the service that you want to write the OPCSystems.net tags to. We're going to select the local service and browse for the tag value 01 and select the value parameter. We then enter the field name to map to that OPCSystems.net tag, and that needs to be value 01 because that's the field name we used in the table. The data type is a double float, and we'll select OK. We'll add 2 more fields for value 02 and value 03. Value 02 field name and now value 03. You can also export all of your field definitions by right-clicking in the field list and selecting CSV Export. You can then use Microsoft Excel to set up all of these tags and fields. Under the Database tab, we want to change the table name from multiple records to single record. We are now going to implement the query string property to return just one record from that table, either for lot 1 or lot 2. To do that, we're going to need to add a new OPC Systems.NET tag. So let's go to the Configure Tag selection and add a new tag called lot number. Select the lot number tag that was just added and change its data type to an integer. Enter a value of 1 and apply those changes. Now let's add another tag that we're going to use as a calculation, and we'll call that tag name query string. Select the query string tag and set its data type to string. Set the data source to calculation, and now we're going to enter in a calculation that will use the value from the lot number and create a where statement. Choose the Edit button to the right, and in the Calculation dialog, enter this calculation, that is where lot number is equal to the value of the lot number tag. This will allow us to only return the record that matches the specific lot number equal to the current lot number tag. When you click OK, if the syntax is correct, the calculation will be placed into the calculation field. We can then select Apply Changes, and then you will see the value of where lot number equals 1 in the value field itself. We are now ready to use that tag in the recipe configuration for the query string property. Return back to the recipe configuration and click the checkbox that says Set Query String with Tag. Browse for the OPC Systems.NET tag on the local service with the tag name query string and select the value parameter. Select OK and then click the Add button to add the single record recipe execution to the list of recipe executions. We can then use the Save feature to save the recipes to the configuration file. And now we're ready to run that recipe execution. Return back to Configure Tags and go to the Trigger tag. If the current value is true, set it back to false with Apply Changes, and then set it back to true again. And now under the value fields of 1, 2, and 3, you should have the values 101, 102, and 103 respectively. And now let's go up to the lot number tag, change its value from 1 to 2, click Apply Changes, then return to the Trigger tag and execute the recipe again by setting the value to false and then back to true. We then have under the value tags the values 201, 202, and 203 for each of the value tags.